All right, so real quick, before we put a final bow on this game, I'd love to talk a little bit about the LSU coaching situation. Over the weekend, a couple of things happened. It seemed like Herman was flirting a little bit with LSU and possibly playing LSU and Texas off of one another when we all kind of thought that one, LSU's not going to outbid Texas, and two, Herman's a Texas guy, so he's probably going there anyway if it's available. What we talked also about when I asked you who the options were, you said Jimbo Fisher or bust, and bust was Ed Orgeron. So gotta tip my hat a little bit to you on that because I honestly, deep down inside, did not think they would stick with Orgeron. I really felt like, given his track record and given the fact, I saw a stat this weekend that showed Orgeron's 4 or 5 wins as head coach at LSU were more than all 3 years combined when he coached in Oxford as a head coach. So I just didn't feel like LSU was going to fire a national championship coach to hire one of his subordinates. So not just to take a victory lap on calling that right, but maybe give us a little insight into what happened or what you think happened in this coaching search and why they ultimately settled on Orgeron, and then touch maybe a little bit on how realistic the rumors are that he sort of lobbied for the job with giving in some assurances that he could get Lane Kiffin over to be his offensive coordinator.
The important thing to remember in these situations is that the people making decisions are people. And I think it's real easy when you're, locked away from the ivory towers that these guys exist in, to see them as these sort of, larger than life figures with great decision makers around them. And a lot of times these guys are in their positions that they are because they're, lifetime academics, or, maybe they have good records as coaches or whatnot, but it doesn't necessarily qualify them to make really good coaching decision hires. They have a lot of different pressures. Maybe a lot of these guys are where they are because they're great fundraisers. That's often the biggest thing to being an athletic director is you've got to make money for your university and donations and whatnot. And that also tends to make athletic directors people pleasers. The thing I saw with LSU was there was a huge outcry from the fan base for Orgeron just because he is very much a Louisiana guy. And I saw, I think it was I can't remember what broadcast it was, where everybody was talking about how, is there ever been a coach as, just molded to fit a program as Ed Orgeron at LSU? And what I walked away from that going is, there's going to be a lot of support for Orgeron regardless of the situation. And, if he wins big, which he more or less did against Texas A&M, Alleva can hire him and not look bad doing so, and he can do it easily. So it's kind of a low risk candidate for him, at least initially. And the second thing with that is you have to understand who Alleva is. Some of you may be familiar with the Duke lacrosse scandal. Duke had a bunch of lacrosse players who were accused of sexual assault of a woman who was an exotic dancer at a party. They were, they have ended up having candlelight visuals on campus. The players were all expelled from the university. It was a huge snafu. Alleva was the athletic director for Duke at the time, and they kind of threw all the players under the bus. They threw the coach under the bus, and as it turned out, the entire story was fabricated. The prosecutor, who ended up being both disbarred and had felony prosecution against him, was withholding evidence that showed that the exotic dancer basically had slept with some other men, probably didn't want to tell the boyfriend or whatever what happened, and made up the story about being sexually assaulted. No one's ever quite figured out why she fabricated the story, but there was evidence that he knew about that they didn't disclose that it completely exonerated all the players. And when that came out, it was a huge black eye for him. He ends up at LSU. And so you've got a guy that has a past history of bowing the knee to public perception and public peer pressure. that's what framed my whole thought on this Orgeron process. I thought he'd probably go after Fisher, the big name hire. There's a big story that, there was an offer with Herman, and Herman kind of countered offered because Texas was going to come back up, made Alleva mad. So Alleva, this is the story I've heard, said, Ed Orgeron is our guy, and you know what? I've got a coach that wants to be here. So why don't you go to Texas and we'll take the coach that wants to be here? That's great and wonderful, but you're in a high dollar contract negotiation and you have to put yourself a little bit beyond whatever your own personal insult is and, play the negotiation the way it needs to be played. I understand wanting the coach that wants to be there, but, who somebody does or does not insult Alleva should have been completely freaking irrelevant. And like we've talked about, there are probably a lot of people who disagree with me still about Orgeron being a great coach. I note as an interim in his wonderful interim record, he's won exactly one ranked game, and that was against Stanford. I think he's 1-3 or 1-4 against ranked opponents. He lost all his ranked games this year again. And Ole Miss, some rankings, Ole Miss and Arkansas was ranked, but none of them currently are. And he had a terrible track record at Ole Miss. You're LSU. I mean, you can go, maybe Jimbo Fisher wants $8 million. I don't know whether or not that's worth it. Herman wanted $6 million. I don't really know that that's unreasonable in the current coaching market. Frankly, I mean, Texas is going to pay him $5 million, and even if you don't get him, I don't know why you don't go after Larry Fedora or Fuente or Chris Peterson at Washington. They may well have been able to get him. It just seemed really obvious to me that Alleva was going to be way too willing to listen to all the voices around him and the big boosters that love the Cajun guy that's won some games. We talked a lot about how there was all this baffling hype about how Orgeron had turned things around after that Auburn game because they're putting up 40 points a game, when in truth they were playing it was, all rushing defenses worth ranked 100th or worse in the country, and all LSU could do was run the ball. And I think it's horribly misplaced. Maybe I'll be proven wrong with time. I think he may have a good year or two because he's a good motivator, but Orgeron's struggle has never been motivation and coaching Monday through Friday during the season. Orgeron has always struggled heavily with organizing off season, trying to schedule meetings, recruiting schedules. Orgeron may be a great recruiter, but he's not going to be personally responsible for recruiting. Saban does not have many recruits that he recruits directly. His assistants do it. Saban sets a schedule. Saban helps evaluate prospects. Saban assigns recruiters to a player, and all he does is come in and close. Orgeron in that administrative role is just not what he is really best at. And I really worry that this hire could be a major blunder that they will regret tremendously about 3 years down the road.
And just to put a final point on it, I like Orgeron. I actually have always liked him and had a little bit of interest in his career. But what I do find interesting about this situation is LSU caved to keeping the nice guy last year that had the fan support, had the players carrying him off the field after beating an overrated A&M team. And we're seeing the cautionary tale play out in Texas right now, where they hired a high character, super nice guy who was frankly unqualified to be the head coach at Texas, and they're paying for it mightily. Now, they may have gotten their man in Herman, maybe not, but they've also been set back 5-6 years as a program because of what they went with in Strong. So college sports are so big time now that, to your most excellent point, you can't just cave to hiring the guy you like. You can't cave to hiring your buddy, cough, Jim McElwain, Doug Nussmeier, or Butch Jones, and DeBoard.
Mike DeBoard. Yeah, we already railed on that one.
So I think that we're still. It's so funny because this is like, you're a businessman at that point. When you're an AD of a giant school like that, you're managing millions of dollars and they're under your purview, and you need to make business decisions, not what makes you feel good at night decisions. And sometimes that means hiring the jerk. It worked out for Alabama, and it's going to work out for other teams in the future. So am I way off base there? Or is that kind of what you're saying?
It is what you're saying, and I'll even add to it because I think this is a really good point that when we talk about these coaches and their salaries and these short leashes, I personally hate it when these coaches complain about, it didn't used to be this way, and then we rewarded loyalty, and now they have too quick a trigger. I think sometimes people do have too quick a trigger to fire someone that has one bad year. I think Ole Miss was idiotic to fire David Cutcliffe and replace him with Ed Orgeron, right? Because he had one bad year. He loses Eli Manning. They are co-West Division champions. The only time they've ever done that in their entire history, and then they have a bad year and they fire the coach. I mean that I don't. I think that's insane. But at the same time, if you see your program sliding, these guys are paid way too much money to complain now. I mean, they're making 5, 6, 7 million dollars a year. They are CEOs. You have to understand your expectation level is commensurate with the salary, commensurate with the scale of the position, and you have to treat it that way. You have to have a short leash. Texas needs to be willing to say, we're going to give Herman 2 or 3 years. If he isn't panning out in 2 or 3 years, we're going to yank him and start over again. And yeah, there's a lack of continuity there, and that can be damaging. But you do kind of have to cycle until you find the right guy, because eventually you will land a Nick Saban if you're a big time program, or an Urban Meyer. It does happen. It just it takes time, and you have to be willing to know that 1 in 3 guys will pan out. So we're going to have to burn through till we get them. And sort of, I think, to finish this up and wrap it up with a bow on my end, I think you also have to be cautious on all these promises made by coaches, and getting too much of a sunshine pumping in your own head to say, well, this is the plan and this is how it's going to work and it's all going to be great. There's a lot of talk right now and hype that, Ed Orgeron has this plan that he's going to hire Lane Kiffin and keep around Tom Aranda, and they have this wonderful coordinating staff. Okay, first off, no one can guarantee you're going to have Kiffin or Aranda. Not Kiffin, not Aranda, not Orgeron. They maybe want to stay there now, and I'm sure Aranda, who oddly used to be Orgeron's boss and is now his underling, would tell Orgeron he loves to stay there. But I will be very surprised if his college roommate, Tom Herman, who's now the head coach at Texas, who can easily outbid LSU, does not hire away Aranda. And second, Kiffin, okay, first, your Kiffin will take the job. I'm sure he said he'll take it, but you don't know if he's going to go be a head coach somewhere else. And even if he does go, you don't know if he'll leave to be a head coach. But regardless, that point is, there is no loyalty from any of these coaches. The coaches, especially coordinators, are going to leave at the drop of a hat for a better program. And so you have to understand the level of the game you're playing at. There's no loyalty by the coaches. There needs to be no loyalty to you as a hiring body to make sure that you have the best qualified guy you can have in a position. Because if you don't, you're going to be in rough shape, and everybody else is going to snatch up the better guys. And if you're relying on coordinators the way I think LSU is going to try to do to be successful, either the coordinators aren't going to be very good, or somebody is going to hire them to be a head coach. You are not going to keep them. You need a head coach that you're paying enough money and that is good enough to solidify the program no matter what happens. And I think they failed.
And for once, we agree on this completely. I think it's funny just to illustrate sort of where we are in terms of coaching and expectations. My dad texted me after Charlie Strong got fired, and he was like, "I can't believe they only gave him 3 years. This is ridiculous that we're pulling the trigger on these coaches so fast." And it's just so funny because that's the perception of someone who grew up as a fan of all these iconic coaches in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who, hung around forever and were given a long leash because they were not making that much money. And they were just coaches, and it wasn't a big business. So in just, 15 years or so, we've made this transition to college football being a business, and it's taken a little bit for the fandom and the perception to catch up to what I think is reality. So it'll be interesting to see how Orgeron plays out next year. I think he'll have enough talent on his team that he could fall down into 8 wins. So go ahead.
I do agree there. I think they should be good by default for a year or two. I've still questioned. I can't underemphasize how fast they were a disaster at Ole Miss, how quickly they became so bad. I mean, they had winning seasons for several years before he got hired, and then he wins, I think, 5 games in 3 years. I but I just I know I interrupted you, but I'm just awaiting the John L. Smith moment here. I am really worried there will be a John L. Smith sort of expectation, interest, and they get to the beginning of the season and you realize what the hell have these guys been doing for 8 months?
Yeah, and I hope that isn't the case because LSU, since being revitalized with Nick Saban, has been such a great staple of the modern SEC era of dominance, and the SEC needs them to continue to be that.